morning, and welcome to our panel discussion on agricultural opportunities in Africa. I'm Linda Manda. I'm the Global Sector Head for Agribusiness at Standard Bank Group. This morning's discussion is all about agriculture, the biggest employer in Africa, and a sector with the potential of unlocking and driving Africa's sustainable growth, given the numerous opportunities it holds. In fact, as much as 60% of the world's uncultivated land is in Africa, representing unused land that could increase production by threefold if appropriate production methods are employed. In addition to having abundant natural resources, we also have a young and growing population. Agriculture accounts for at least 15% of the continent's GDP and contributes to over 50% of employment. Rising urbanization and higher per capita consumption by urban populations is supporting long-term growth in consumer demand for agro-processed products. However, it's worth noting that despite the growing urbanization rate, the bulk of Africa's population remains predominantly rural. Furthermore, in the face of these enviable resources, Africa is a net importer of food. It's highly dependent on food and agriculture imports, and this weighs heavily on the continent's current account and results in food insecurity. But new opportunities are still abound. And to mention just a few, in terms of value chains, we've got infrastructure developments in areas such as storage and cold chain, advances in technology such as agri-tech and mobile phone adaptation. And we have our biggest game changer in the form of the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, which promotes intra-African trade and creates a much larger market for local production to then compete with our typical import and distribute model. This morning, I'm joined by a panel of experts who will help us in identifying and exploring key themes to unlocking opportunities in the African agricultural landscape. I have with me Kevin Ngugu, Michael Holter, Duncan Bonnett, and Wandile Sihlobo. I think we can kick off with the panelists introducing themselves and just saying a little bit about what they do in terms of the agricultural sector. Wandile?
Good morning, Linda, and good morning to the fellow panelists. Good to join you this morning. My name is Wandile Sihlobo, as you rightly introduced. I am with the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. We are sitting now as I'm joining this panel from Pretoria. Now, the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa is basically a number of role players that are operating within the food value chain in South Africa. That's before the farming, which is the financial institutions, and obviously after the farmer, which is all of the grain handlers and the processors, machinery suppliers like your usual ones, John Deere's and the likes, and also the seed suppliers. So it's pretty much that value chain that we represent here. We're operating primarily here in South Africa, but also have a reach through our members in a number of the African countries. And I think that's where perhaps, Linda, I will make my entry into this discussion, because I do feel that for a number of years, we have been talking about the potential that lies within agriculture in the African continent. But there's little that has transpired over the past couple of decades in actually being able to make action on realizing that particular potential. And this, in my mind, it comes into a number of steps that I think we need to pretty much focus on in order to be able to unlock that. The first thing that bothers me a lot about Africa's agriculture is the lower productivity that we see across a number of value chain. And I think that this becomes, at least in my mind, a hindrance, even if you are thinking either about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or anything that we will do in the continent, because without a number of countries having the volumes that are required to be able to trade with the other partners in the continent, we will remain with this relationship that is leaning, favoring few countries. Take, for example, South Africa being one of those because of its productivity capabilities. And obviously then one has to ask themselves to say, okay, to actually be able to improve that productivity, what do we have to do across the continent? And I think there you already spoken to some of those. You said, look, there are people that are focusing on improving the skills of the farmers, the skills of the people that are in agriculture. But I think there are other more policy interventions that are needed onto that, which will pretty much attract the investment. The first one for me is the issue around African countries embracing technology, either it's genetically modified crops or any other technologies, because we have seen how that has benefited the countries that have embraced that. A case in point being my own country, South Africa. If, for example, you look at corn yields, you will see that South Africa is at 5 point something, while a number of African countries are still tapering below 1.5 tons per hectare. That's been one of those key points. And the second point, Linda, that I think maybe we might have to reflect on also within the panel is the issue around about land governance in the African continent. Because if you are thinking then about attracting major investments in agriculture, the story around land governance needs to be clear. Handing off the tradable title deeds or land rights to African farmers is one of the things that, to my mind, I think it's important, especially in the topics around the infrastructure that will be needed for investments and boosting the volumes. And I think those are some of the entry points that, as we proceed with this discussion, I might revisit, and I think that are important when we think about African agricultural development for the coming years. Let me pause there for now, Linda.
Thank you very much, Wandile. I think we can bring in Duncan into the discussion.
Linda, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm Duncan Bonnett from Africa House. We're a consultancy based here in South Africa that focuses on intra-African trade, project and investment development. Within the agricultural space, that obviously goes across much more than primary production into logistics, infrastructure, and then post-harvest production as well. And I think, you know, we've already, between Linda and Wandile, we've touched on a number of the key issues. And from our perspective, I hear that it's an important point that Africa has 60% of the world's available arable land, but without infrastructure to support it, it's like farming on the moon. You know, it really is meaningless if you have the infrastructure to get the food from farm to fork. And that includes road infrastructure, it includes power, you need cold storage, you need warehouse, you need adequate supplies of water, sanitation, irrigation, all of those kinds of things that underpin agricultural production across the continent. So I think, you know, we like to look at it and say, yes, we have an enormous amount of agricultural potential, but we do need those underpinning infrastructures in place in order to realize that potential. And I think if we look a little bit further down the line and you say, well, you know, Africa is an enormous place. Some of the underlying statistics, the DR Congo being the size of Western Europe, has the same length of tarred roads as Singapore. You start to understand some of the constraints around unlocking that potential. But I think let's turn that around a little bit. We talk about urbanization. Urbanization is not just moving from rural to urban. Most cities in Africa today are third and fourth generation residents. So people are not simply moving from rural communities into urban. There is that, but there is also internal growth within those cities. The UN estimates that some of the data that I've got from them, currently there's around 55 or 56 cities that have a population of 1 million or more in sub-Saharan Africa. In 15 years, that number will double. In other words, we can have 110, 115 cities with 1 million people or more, and probably 2.5 times as many with 500,000 people or more. So you can see the demand for food in our cities and in our urban spaces is growing at an enormous pace. And what we don't want, in 2018, Africa imported around $50 billion worth of agricultural and food products. If we are suddenly doubling the number of people who are living in cities, we don't want to double the amount of food that we import when we have that available arable land. And I think this is one of the key challenges that African countries and African cities face. And I think we are going to start to see a lot more activity from local and regional governments rather than national governments to ensure that you have food security. We saw when food prices spiked a few years ago, riots in places like Senegal and Mozambique, where prices of food, basic foodstuffs, became unsustainable, and we don't want that. So I think you will start to see policy interventions around that to ensure that you not only have adequate food, but that it's decent food and that it is priced at a level that entry-level consumers in urban areas are able to afford. And I think that's a really important part of this whole debate. In some countries, we are now starting to see the move towards that downstream agricultural production, either organically, if you'll pardon the pun, or through more regulatory mechanisms where you're starting to see the banning of the import of things like edible oils and flours. So you can import the raw material, but you have to then process it in country. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've had the pleasure of visiting probably about 14 different countries, looking at food and agricultural production. And in almost every single one of them, there is a move to say, why are we importing chicken from Brazil or the US when we can produce it locally? Why are we importing edible oils from Indonesia and Malaysia when we can produce them locally? And I think that really is where we're starting to see perhaps the convergence of the growing demand through growing populations, and particularly urban populations, the ability of governments to start projecting and saying, we need to be able to feed our own populations, and then obviously regional and global populations as well. So I think that where we sit at the moment, and I think one of the lessons that I did pick up was being told in Kinshasa by one of the government officials we talked to, and he said, I really like the fact that you've come and talked to me about potential investment. Now, please leave my office and come back with some actual investment. And this is really where we need that conversation to move.
And Duncan, at that point,
yeah.
At that point, I mean, we've covered quite a bit, but that's a very good point in terms of all this dialogue cannot come to fruition without the appropriate investment. Just a note to the audience, please make use of the chat box if you've got any questions for the panelists and for the topics being presented. But talking about investments, if I can bring in Michael here to give us his views on sustainable investments in the African agricultural landscape.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning. And thanks, Duncan and Kelvin, for already having shared your, shared your thoughts. By introduction, I'm the portfolio manager of the Africa Agriculture and Trade Investment Fund. So by definition, we are an investor. It's a PPP structure, so we have public sector funds in our fund as we have private sector funds. And it has been initiated in the last crisis. So when 10 years before, we saw that the food prices, as Duncan already mentioned, went up, and there was a significant undersupply of food in the continent. That's when the German government thought it may be a good idea to create a fund which is going to invest into the agricultural value chains. And that's what we do. We are lending not only to primary farming, we do have primary farming in our books, but we are mainly investing in food processing and trade activities onshore as well as from continent to continent. Fund is around 300 million invested over the lifetime since now, and it keeps growing over the years and time. When Duncan said, well, come back with tangible investment solutions, I had to smile a little bit, because that's, of course, what everyone wants to have. Everyone wants to have the running factory at 70% utilization, 80% utilization, producing good returns, producing income, producing jobs. I mean, these are the lighthouse transactions any politician would like to shine in. But the truth is, picking out the value, the cashew value chain, where people are moaning, why are cashews being peeled in Vietnam instead of Africa? Look at Cote d'Ivoire, you have 14 factories sitting more or less idle there, 10, 15% utilization rate, 20% utilization rate. And more capacity is being added even during that period of time. So what makes the difference between Vietnam as a peeling station or a country where you can peel successfully and then export versus an onshore factory that may or may not operate? From our experience, and that's not only relevant for this value chain in that country, but specifically across, I think, anything you could choose, it's the educational level, it's the skill set. So it's not only to have the road in place. Yeah, you can have the road to be in place, for sure. But what you need is a skilled workforce in the factory that can produce to the national standards, the local standards, or even the international standards. If you don't get accredited to the health and safety regulation of those export nations you want to export to, there is no point. You will never win. They will always insist on onshore production, or at least in a factory that is labeled and licensed appropriately. The other piece is machinery can't just be imported and then you think it's running on its own. It will break, it needs repair, it needs engineers, it needs someone who knows how the factory operates and what to do if the mill, for example, breaks down. And yes, electricity is needed, no question. But there are enough solutions to that problem. So when I look at those portfolio companies we have invested in that are successful, and we had our lessons learned, we all, I think, share experience where we had to suffer from losses. But when we look at those that have that are successful, they then at some point in time install the rooftop installation and produce energy themselves, and that's no problem for them at all, because it's a kind of a binary, it's a secondary ranking priority. But the first ranking priority is their capacity to produce high quality products for the local market. And this is where sometimes entrepreneurs, especially foreigners, misjudge the market completely. The market is extremely competitive, extremely quality orientated. It's not so much the mass market you can make business in successfully. You start normally at the topper end and then you walk down. Yeah. So first you produce something that you can sell with a decent margin. That may qualify you then for the offshore markets as well, or the regional trade markets. And then you go into the mass production, because then you have built up your brand, you have built up a loyal customership, you have built up your distribution channels, etc. That I think is essentially something we have experienced in all the companies that have been successful so far.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we've talked about productivity. We've looked at connecting the different points in the value chain. One critical component to the African agricultural value chain is the smallholder farmer. You cannot ignore the contribution of the smallholder farmer to the to African agricultural production. They're critical in food systems and livelihood all throughout the continent, and are quite dominant in key cash crops. So Kelvin, how are we seeing the narrative of smallholders changing with developments that are continuing to come up on the landscape, and some of the developments that Wandile, Michael, and Duncan have already spoken?
Yes, so my name is, I'm Kelvin Dungu. I'm the Executive Director at the Global Agricultural Solutions. So thank you very much, Linda, for your question. I think the other panelists, Michael, Duncan, and Wandile have laid the foundation in this discussion. So in my experience, working with small-scale farmers, smallholder farmers in Kenya and in the whole of East Africa, there are a number of challenges that that are affecting the small-scale farmers that hinder them from attaining their maximum potential in terms of production. And I think from my experience, the information, getting the right information on what to produce, what to grow, how to add value, are the main challenges that we encounter when engaging farmers, small-scale farmers. One of the panelists has correctly pointed out that we have a problem in terms of growing populations, and we feel that it is very important for going forward for policymakers to focus mainly on the youth, because the youth, when we correctly tap into their energies, we can be able to solve, this big problem of low production in agriculture. If we focus the youth towards agriculture, make it attractive to the youth, then they can channel their energies towards agriculture. Agriculture is not attractive to many youth in Africa. When they think of the problems that their parents, and those who came before them are experiencing, nobody wants to get involved in agriculture. So it's very important for the stakeholders in the agricultural sector to focus on making agriculture attractive, so that we have the burgeoning population thinking about production. One of the panelists talked about uprisings that we have experienced in various countries, and this can simply be solved by focusing our youth towards agriculture, towards production, expanding markets, expanding the value chain, and that way we can be able to have a population that is growing and has opportunities. So there are many ways in which we can be able to solve the challenges that come from that are in the agricultural sector, and from this discussion we'll come up with tangibles that we can be able to implement in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Earlier on, Wandile lamented about low productivity. And with increasing productivity or inefficient productivity comes also the strain on the environment. And by making agricultural value chains more environmentally resistant, agriculture then is part of the solution in terms of addressing climate change. And in a post-COVID-19 world, given the disruptive nature of accelerating climate change and environmental degradation, what opportunities or pathways do you see are available to us to respond to climate change in Africa?
Linda, I will abuse the panel because I'm already on the table, because here Michael came up with interesting points. There are interesting points from Duncan, interesting points from Kevin, and the question that you have already raised. But before coming on that, I want to pick up on the points that Duncan is raising, and I want that Kevin is raising, and I wonder if Duncan can also add on to this, because Linda, one of the points that is coming out of here, and you referred to this also in your opening remarks, where you say, let's get young people to be attracted and get into agriculture. You mentioned the youth population. But my difficulty with this story, it goes to the point of saying, if then, as you rightly put it out, Kevin, young people have seen their grandmothers and their fathers and all of those people struggled through agriculture. And I can place this even in my own experience. I come from the eastern side of South Africa, which was a former homeland called the Transkei region. We don't have large commercial farming in that part of South Africa, even though as a country, we are a modernized agricultural community. Now, if you have only been in the Transkei region and not in other parts of South Africa, agriculture as a young person to you doesn't get appealing because it is not in a level that you feel that it can generate sufficient capital for you to sustain your family and be able to attain other things. So my contribution or addition to the points that Kevin have made, I could go back to the initial points that I had tried to suggest on it, and Duncan can expand on that to say, how do we make agriculture more profitable for young people and competitive with the other sectors? Because at the end of the day, everyone wants to work where they can generate sufficient revenue and improve their living standards. If agriculture is not going to be able to make people better off to reach into that level, we're going to continue to see young people moving out of the sector. And then this goes back to say then, try to make agriculture a bit more productive. And I would even present it to all of us in this panel to say, guys, one of the other things that I think we need to move on is to have to think seriously about the commercialization of agriculture in the African continent. We cannot continue with the idea of only having a small plots of land and small farmers. It needs to be thought about as a business. And I think when we begin to think about this way, it makes business for Michael to come and actually see value chain and invest in a value chain that will get consistent, high quality supplies that is coming out of all of this modernized agricultural pathway. And I think, Linda, even then going back to the initial question that you presented to me, I think this begins to link back there because you are saying climate change is a big issue for agriculture. How do we begin then to making sure it's a big thing for the world, but how does agriculture begin to cope well with this? And I think that me sitting here and saying, look at certain technologies, look at better seeds that could increase your productivity and maybe be more tolerant to drier weather conditions. To a smallholder farmer in Transkei, outside of Lilongwe, somewhere outside of Mashonaland in Zimbabwe, that is like a far cry thing. It's too far. You're telling him to look for these seeds. But if he was modernized, generating enough revenue, he's able to say, hey, Bear, do you have better seeds that are able to, that you are breeding, that are able to cope with these environments? And he has money behind that. And then the seed and the technology developers will now be at a position where they say, look, there are clients in that area that is affected by climate change. They have money behind them. Let's think of seed breeding methods that will be able to cope with those climatic conditions that are erupting in that area. And I think the story of productivity also now makes a point of saying we can be able to get more yields by still growing in a certain small parcel of land, like in South Africa, where we do 20% of sub-Saharan African maize production comes from South Africa in an area of about 2.5 million hectares of land. Nigeria plants 5 million hectares of land, but they only produce about 11% of sub-Saharan Africa's maize. And the key thing in there, they are using more land, producing less because of that lower productivity. But now if you can then boost your yields in a small land parcel, you are able to leave more fallow land that is making the planet much more greener. You are not over stretching the resources of the land. And I think that for me, that would be one of the key ways of thinking about, to say technology will be a solution, but technology developers will only be incentivized if those people that needs their solution have the money behind them. And the money will only be generated if we are producing something that we could put in the marketplace at a right quality, as Michael was saying. And Duncan might have ideas into this, having traveled across the continent. Thanks.
Thank you, Wandile. Duncan?
Yeah, thanks for throwing me in the deep end there, Wandile. I think that you're quite right. And I think the linkages and the chains, and with the advent of things like blockchain technology, instant payments, it does start to make agriculture slightly more attractive proposition. But what it does require, and I think you're quite right, market access. And by market access, I'm not just talking about the physical infrastructure, but access into formal tradable markets, whether they are into supermarket chains here in South Africa or across the region, or into processing facilities and so on. And that does require a fair amount of interaction between the producers. I spend a lot of time down in the Eastern Cape, so I know exactly where you're coming from in terms of those smallholder farmers and the lack of infrastructure, but also the lack of access that they just have to formal retail markets. So I think you do need to create that. And I think you can, through technology, create some of those linkages, through WhatsApp, through telecommunications, that it makes it a lot easier for people to communicate around that and also to get paid. I'm going to throw something into the mix, which will probably be very unpopular, around climate change, and that is that Africa has an enormous natural gas endowment. And whilst we see the world screaming to stop natural gas production, it can be used very effectively to produce fertilizers. And that, again, would help to increase the productivity of farming in Africa, and would also help then, as you say, to be able to leave more land fallow, to have that crop rotation. So I think that those are quite important issues around that. And then just in order to encourage youth into the agricultural value chain, I think it's important to understand that value chain. It's not just around being primary farmers, but to encourage people right through the chain into the transport, the logistics, the packaging, which is very important if you want to have agricultural products that are attractive. So it's the whole value chain.
If I may add, Linda.
Yes, Michael.
There was one point I would agree with Wandile, not with all of them, but one he picked up. He said it's the food price. The farmer will produce what people will buy. And you can't change the product mix starting at the farmer level. So if it's a beef farmer, it will be a beef farmer. And if people will eat beef, they will eat beef. But what we observe, and if research is right, I think the trend will continue, is that the price for food will go up, not necessarily because we would like it to be, or we would like smallholder farmers to have a bigger share in the revenues of a certain food product, but because the climate change will force out existing and large producers. So if you think about wheat production in the US or wheat production in Ukraine, if climate change patterns will continue to change, they will have more volatility in their production, which they can't stop, because you can't irrigate the fields in the US. It's impossible. I mean, yes, you can dream about irrigation systems to be installed, but with that amount of hectarage, it will push the price up to the degree that an African farmer will become competitive. And that is the key entry point. It's the globalization which is emerging from the climate change pattern, which is hitting the large producers. And that's a big opportunity, and it's not an opportunity you need to work a lot on. It will come. Yeah, you just need to pick it up. And I think then we will be there where Wandile wants smallholder farmers or also young farmers to be, because they will identify that there is money in the business. We had the same pattern over here. I'm also coming from a region where traditionally a farmer was a rich man. You had land, you had cows, you had income. But when milk prices started to drop, food prices started to drop, and Germany is a very efficient market, efficient in the sense of it has a lot of production and it has a lot of power at the producers or the consumer end in order to decrease prices. And when the milk per liter was dropping, the price per liter milk was dropping to 20 cents, 30 cents, that's not sustainable for a farmer either, having 30, 40 cows. It isn't in Europe and it isn't in Africa. Nothing will change there, right? But if there is no longer the ability of a certain market to produce for a worldwide consumption, then you will inevitably have a price which is going up in relative share to the household income. So that, I think, is a pattern we need to get ready for. Prepare population that you will need to pay more for your food as a percentage of your household income, and you will turn into a local consumer in a sense of you're consuming what is being locally produced. And that will hit other value chains. Let's not forget about those. Let's not forget that Africa is one of the largest exporters of agricultural products. So either the onshore consumption pattern is changing such that it's replicating the international demand, or the farmers are fast enough to adapt to the local food mix that the population, the growing population, the hopefully more wealthy population is going to buy. I think this is a change which is coming from climate change. I don't have the solution to combat climate change or climate mitigation here. I don't think it will necessarily sit only in the farming level. I think it's sitting at the consumer level. But there also the pattern is changing. So the debate around healthy food, what healthy means, not only for you, but also for the planet, that is ongoing, and it will inevitably change the consumption pattern.
Yes, we are already seeing evidence of changes in consumption patterns and changes being driven from the consumer side and back through to the value chain. But whilst we're still on that issue of productivity, the agricultural value chain in Africa is highly fragmented. We're talking about the need to increase productivity, to become more competitive, to be able to compete on an international scale and come to the party, given what we're seeing is happening globally. But how practical and achievable is that, given how fragmented the value chain currently is?
If I may jump in, Linda, I just want to carry on with the discussion that something that Duncan has said, and I feel I need to say that Africa needs to come up with Africa-focused solutions, because we really need to first understand what is that is ailing Africa, the agricultural sector in Africa, and how we can be able to use agriculture to to solve the problems that are affecting Africa. And what works, and this could be controversial, but what works in the West that will not necessarily work for Africa. For example, he pointed out about the availability of gas and natural resources. In the West, climate change is a problem all over. But for Africa, we need that gas to improve production, make energy cheaper for the farmer, and this will help the farmer produce even better, because the production costs will go down. In Africa, for instance, GMO is not very popular with very many households and farmers. So if we have Africa-focused solutions, such as organic farming, using herbs or local resources to preserve our foods, using organic fertilizer from bioslurry from cows. If we have our own solutions crafted for Africa, I think that way we'll be able to have our own green revolution, and this is happening in many jurisdictions, many countries, such as Tanzania, one of the countries that we are working with. We are working in. Tanzanians are coming up with their own herbicides and fertilizers for their farms, and this has enabled them to increase production, especially in maize. So if we have our, solutions that are crafted for Africa, then that we will be able to see change and growth in agriculture.
Indeed, Calvin, I think appropriate technology rather than technology for the sake of technology itself. And I think your argument can also be expanded into the policy making scenario where policies should be appropriate and befitting for the continent rather than just a cut and paste of what is happening elsewhere. But before I start preaching, Wandile looks like he wants to add to the conversation again.
Yeah, I mean, Linda, you raise an important point about fragmented value chains in the African continent. Kevin speaks about us, each country is having its own solutions for their problems. And again, I might be speaking in a place of ignorance sitting in South Africa, but this for me also begins to be one of the issues. My thinking, and goes back to the point, I don't know if it came from Michael or if it came from Duncan earlier, about us embracing this regional value chain. If you think, for example, Linda, about the poultry sector in South Africa, one of the reasons that makes poultry farming in South Africa not very competitive is obviously because of the higher input cost, which is your soybeans, as well as maize, which we import about 500,000 tons of soybean oil cake a year from South America. But now, over the past couple of years, say the past 5 years, our neighboring Zambia is a notable increase in the soybean production in there. And that for me suggests that backed with the right capital and backed with the right inputs, Zambia could well be one of the biggest soybean producers. South Africa is unable to actually be able to achieve that because we can only do a lot of soybeans in the eastern side of the country, the same area where we're also producing yellow maize. As you increase your soybeans, you're eating down on your yellow maize. So you have those zero-sum game that is playing part on them. But if we, as a Southern Africa perspective, to say, okay, Zambia, can you do a lot of this soybeans? Then South Africa, as we're already having the capabilities of poultry production, we can bring in some of that soybean down here, or even crush Zambia and then bring the soybean oil cake down close to us. Or even looking at Malawi, where I know that there are already studies that were done by the University of Johannesburg and some colleagues in the World Bank on looking at these oil seeds value chains and be able to move all of these products across us. But then this introduces one of the points that is coming from Kelvin as an issue about saying, look, let's have our own way of doing things whereby we can produce organically or we can produce a certain way. This is the issue about the harmonization of the products and the seeds and the quality of the standards in the African continent. Because in South Africa, for example, since 2001, we pretty much opened up the regulation when it comes to genetically modified crops. Our soybeans is about 95% genetically modified. Our maize is about 85%. That might have raised concerns of certain people in our community, but we cannot ignore even the benefits in as far as the output perspective. Now, as the region, let's say now South Africa region, if we're thinking about those regional value chains, we have then to bring, to your point again, Linda, the policy making perspective of saying, but about the standards of the products that we produce, what conversation should we be having as a continent? Both on the output perspective and also on the inputs on the seeds perspective. And I think those are serious discussions that politicians needs to actually be serious about and not only be talking about, oh, we have now in Africa certain point, but there's no actionable things that actually allows businesses to make the decisions and to make the necessary investments and also actually see that things can happen. And the last point here, Linda, sorry, I'm taking a bit long here, is also on the trade policies of some of these African countries. We cannot have a situation where Zambia, for example, invokes its trade policy to block exports whenever they feel like their consumers are threatened. Maybe looking domestically from a Zambian perspective, that policy approach makes sense for the near term to say, I'm blocking the exports of maize because food inflation is rising. But for South African farmers that have invested in Zambia, thinking about the regional approach of things and they want to move those goods, it introduces all of the inefficiencies. And now thinking forward, you say, no, I'm not going to be doing business with Zambia. I'll stick with the Argentinians because they're not going to invoke trade policy whenever they feel like it or whenever elections are approaching. These are some of the realities that I think in the continent, however uncomfortable they are, if we are thinking about long-term investments and well-coordinated supply chain, we need to be about, in my perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wandile. Yes, Duncan.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Wandile's point around the regionalization of agri-trade and value chains. You know, one of the reasons why trade in Southern Africa in particular is so expensive is because you have thousands of trucks going north every day and they come back fairly empty. We're not bringing back what we should. Now, we were involved in a study many years ago with the International Trade Center in Geneva, which looked at exactly that. And South Africa, on agri-industrial products, was importing about $1 billion a year of products from the rest of the world, but not the SADC region, that the SADC region was exporting to the rest of the world, but not to South Africa. And there was just this complete mismatch. And part of it, when we investigated with South African importers, was they simply weren't aware of the capacity of the region, or, as Wandile says, some of the knee-jerk policy interventions. We could be importing a whole lot of soy cake from Zambia and bringing back a whole lot of trucks that are filled, containers that are filled. It drops the overall cost. It makes business more predictable, and it makes everybody a lot. It's a lot easier for everybody in that value chain to do business efficiently and effectively. And I think that's a great approach. As Wandile says, it probably requires some uncomfortable policy choices to be made within the region and not just outside of South Africa as well, in order to ensure that we can facilitate at a broader regional level a much more predictable trade in agricultural produce and agricultural value.
Thank you, Duncan. I think the conversation has already begun in terms of increasing intra-Africa trade and the moves we're seeing around the Free Continental Trade Agreement. But I think key now is solid commitment that goes beyond signing on dotted lines. Michael, any last comments?
I think a lot has already been said, and the talk we had was pretty much focused on what politicians should do or what they shouldn't do or what they should change. What I would like to make a statement for in favor of is really the great entrepreneurship we sometimes experience. Sometimes, I have to be honest, and it is not a function of the region we are investing into, but you have entrepreneurs that are overcoming these challenges because they have the right mindset, and that's something we need to support. So as much as we need to think about policy changes to support trade or regulation around food or fertilizers, it's the people that everyone has to invest into and to create an environment where you can have ownership about your destiny, and that creates jobs, that creates value. This is an asset which especially Africa has, given its young population and also in parts a very good educated population, and that's where bureaucracy just shouldn't hinder it developing. That's what I experience so often, that people are giving up or they don't even start, not because they think there is no money in the business, but they say, with all these permits and certificates and registrations I need, I better become a white-collar banking person in Joburg than I become an entrepreneur in my region, and potentially I will earn less money in Joburg net, right, than I would ever do in the area where I'm coming from, setting up my own business. I think that would be my last comment. Say, that's a focus area. So the more you allow for entrepreneurs to be growing and small companies to develop, the more and the faster things will change.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Kevin, any last contributions to the discussion?
Yes, I just want to build on what Michael has just said, that entrepreneurs, individual entrepreneurs and organizations are coming up with solutions, especially with support from donor funding or funds from venture capitalists, are coming up with solutions that are homegrown for Africa. We have many organizations that are coming up with solutions in insurance, insuring agricultural produce, insurance in solar energy, where you can use solar for irrigation. So we have all these solutions that are growing all over Africa. When it comes to government policy, if countries can be able to, at regional level, harmonize policies in agriculture, so that we are able to favor, like what we have in the East African region, countries can be able to trade with each other, reduce barriers. That way we can have agriculture growing at regional level. And the other thing, when we think about the youth, especially the youth, because that is my focus, if we are able to educate the youth, align education towards growth in agriculture, make agriculture attractive. One way in which we really advocate making agriculture attractive is by use of by mechanizing agriculture. Right from the point of planting to the point of post-harvest value addition. That way you expand the whole value chain, because when you value add, of course the market becomes better, and when you value add in according to the standards, the world standards, then that way you expand your markets. That way you'll be able to have small-scale farmers or farmers in general getting better prices for their products. So that way you'll also attract a large number of youth into agriculture, because if the perception they have of agriculture is what their parents used to do, then that is what makes a lot of youth move to other jobs and not think of agriculture as a way of living. Yes.
Thank you very much, Calvin. So I think we've talked much about increasing or improving productivity and the need to ensure that the youth are an integral part of the solutioning. And we've been reminded of the need to be mindful in terms of appropriate technology as well as policy. And when we're talking about technology, we're not just talking about equipment. We're talking about farming methodologies and skilling the workforce. We talked about shortening this rather fragmented value chain, allowing for visibility of all the players in the value chain from seed to fork, and the need to ensure that we maximize and respond with an efficient response with the use of all the continent's natural resources, and how that can also impact climate change and patterns. The point on harmonization of policy and tapping into regional value chains, I think is somewhere where this conversation will progress in future. And of course, none of this can be done in an environment that does not encourage the entrepreneurial spirit. It's been an exciting 1 hour of conversation. If the audience still has comments and questions, please put them through the chat. But for now, let me thank Africa Infrastructure, or Infrastructure Africa, more like, and as well as the panelists. So Kelvin, Michael, Wandile, and Duncan, thank you very much for this exciting conversation.
Thank you.
And enjoy your morning further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.